Hello and welcome to episode 904 of Stand Up. Joining me today, CNN national security expert, author, podcaster, and professor, the great Peter Bergen joins me to talk about his new podcast, In the Room. Awesome conversation with Peter coming up. That starts at about 16 minutes in. But it's August 21st. It's time to stand up. Want to wish my parents, mom and dad, Chuck and Mary, happy 52nd wedding anniversary. I was just with them over the weekend after we dropped Ava off at college, which went very smoothly, very successful, very happy. For her, not for me, but for her. Very, very exciting. She's doing great. She's already making a lot of friends, having an awesome time. I want to thank everybody who reached out to me. So many. I can't get back to everybody. So many folks sent messages and put up comments in different places of my posts about dropping Ava off and how difficult that was. Sharing advice, those of you that have been through it, those of you that are going through it, and of course those of you that someday will go through it. Stay in the moment. That's the advice. Stay in the moment for those of you whose kids are younger or even close to leaving. Stay right there with them. When you catch yourself thinking about the future and your kids going away or anything bad happening to them, come right back to the present where everything is hopefully okay and that thing you're worried about isn't actually happening. But yes, move-in went smoothly. They were running late. There were a lot of issues with students getting unpacked and to their orientation activities on time. And Ava was on the 12th floor of her dorm, which I'm not super excited about, but it is what it is. And, you know, you had to wait for the elevator to bring this huge amount of bags and stuff up to her room. And not my family. Nope. Val and Ava are like, nah, we'll take the stairs. And people are like, you're not going to be able to make it up the stairs. And they said, watch us. And I was like, maybe you should listen to the people. And then I followed my wife and two daughters up 12 flights of stairs with heavy bags. All right, well, they carried the heavy bags. I actually got the lighter bags. It was pretty... I looked pretty bad in the whole situation. The point is, we got it done because this family gets it done when it comes to challenges like, I guess, getting your stuff in your dorm room in time and unpacked so you can make your orientation activities. It went smooth. It was hard to say goodbye. Of course, I cried my face off. Val decided to drive back to my parents where we stayed for the next couple of days. She said, you know what, maybe I'll drive because you're crying so much. But no shame there. And thank you to everybody who's always allowed me to be vulnerable and has said that, you know, when we're vulnerable in front of each other and to each other, it gives one another, especially us fellas, us super masculine dudes, the permission to be vulnerable, to feel our feelings, to share those with each other so that you know you're not alone when you're feeling them. So thank you. I'm so grateful to this community for supporting me and allowing me to be the beta cuck crier the soy boy that I really am. Not even sure what that means, but I know a lot of people have called me that on Twitter, or X, or whatever it's called now. Well, there is a lot happening. I want to get to the news before I get to my guest, and hopefully the climate change hurricanes are going to put out the climate change fires, which seem to be everywhere. I've heard from my friends up in the Pacific Northwest who are dealing with these crazy fires. Shout out to Barrett Coles, who's been a longtime listener and listens every day. Major evacuations up in British Columbia. Fires all over. If you look at a map of where the fires are, they are covering British Columbia down into the rest of the Pacific Northwest. And of course, all of our friends in Southern California listening that are enduring that first, this crazy tropical storm, the first one in like 84 years, of course. And then a 5.0 earthquake struck last night. So I hope you guys are okay. It's not as bad as maybe it was predicted. It was downgraded, but certainly there's going to be some serious issues with flooding in Southern California. And this stuff isn't going to change. So I figured we would try to develop our network further so that when any of us are dealing with these things, we can reach out, we can depend on each other, and if need be, we can support each other. God forbid you've got to evacuate your town, you get nowhere to go. Well, hopefully the stand-up community will be able to support each other as we head into this terrifying era that it looks like we are going to have to get used to. We need to be able to support each other all over the country for all of the different effects of the climate crisis that we are living through, that our kids are going to live through. So let's build that network. Let's keep in touch, share solutions, resources, and support each other any way we can. Lots of listeners living in the affected areas, and reach out to me if you want to record a voice message about what it's like, what you're experiencing, what you're seeing, smelling, feeling. Let me know what it's like. Always happy to hear from you and share your thoughts here on this podcast. And the latest on the storm, headline at Los Angeles Times, Fierce Hillary makes landfall in Baja and takes direct aim at Southern California. Fast-moving Hurricane Hillary, now downgraded to a tropical storm, has already wreaked havoc in Baja California, where it's turned streets into raging rivers. And apparently it's going to go right up through Southern California, right up through Nevada, splitting the state right through the middle of the state of Nevada. So to my listeners out there, thinking about all of you guys as well. By the way, I listened to 3 of the Sunday shows, and they were dominated by talk of what has gone on in Hawaii, this perfect storm that set Hawaii ablaze, where apparently there's still thousands of people missing. Lots of them are kids. Terrifying what's gone on there. Controversy over whether or not the sirens were supposed to come on, these sirens that were built to warn residents of tsunamis, of waterborne dangers, and they weren't apparently prepared or trained to use them for fire that spreads like water. At least that's the reports that I'm hearing. Let me know what you're hearing. All right, and the worst news that I heard over the weekend, or kind of the most tragic story, was from California, Lake Arrowhead to be specific, where the owner of this store in Lake Arrowhead, it's called Magpie, it's like a clothing store, had a gay pride flag flying, or a rainbow flag flying out in front of the store. Woman's name, Lori Carlton, mother of 9, married for 42 years, was murdered because of the pride flag. A man came and argued with her and shot and killed her. And it's a huge story, as it should be, coming out of California. Apparently, the cops then chased him down and killed him. This is in San Bernardino County. You've probably heard about this story. A few of the reactions to this, which I think are powerful and poignant. Paul Feig, the film director, said, Lori Carlton was my friend. She was a wonderful person who did so much for the LGBTQ community as well as the community at large. What happened to her is an absolute tragedy. If people don't think anti-gay and trans rhetoric isn't dangerous, think again. Andy Richter from Conan writes, anyone with right-leaning tendencies who is indulging in the current anti-trans and anti-gay propaganda smokescreen and or helping spread it, this obscene tragedy is the result of what you're doing. She had 9 children. My former Congressman Mondaire Jones, openly gay himself, writes, I'm heartbroken for Lori Carlton and her loved ones. A senseless murder is the foreseeable result of hateful rhetoric, policies, and even a recent Supreme Court decision that make the LGBTQ community second-class citizens and endanger our allies. Tim Wise tweeted, a right-wing bigot gunned down a California business owner for flying an LGBTQ pride flag because these people's insecurities rule them. There's a guy down the street from me with a straight pride flag. Yes, there is one. And I find it sufficient to mock him for being a loser, but not to kill him. One more, Alejandro Caraballo tweets, Christopher Rufo, Tucker Carlson, Kaya Rychik, and Matt Walsh have blood on their hands. They spent the last year telling people the pride flag sexualizes children and then tells their viewers to arm themselves. This is the end result. A collection of outrage reactions on this horrible, horrible crime that occurred in Southern California that I wanted to mention. I'm sure people want to talk about that, and I hope it doesn't make people afraid. It's understandable, but to fly that flag out in front of their store, in front of their home, in their schools, there's so many people now that believe that homosexuality is equivalent somehow to preying on children sexually, and that the rainbow flag is about groomers. And that's what they're hearing from anywhere from the governor of Florida and his advisors like Christopher Rufo, who I mentioned, to Tucker Carlson, all these other commentators who are saying these kinds of things. It's absolutely horrific, and it's not going to work. It's going to scare people. It's going to terrorize people, but people aren't going to go back in the closet, and we're not going backwards in this country on these issues. We're going to keep on fighting, obviously, and just a horrible story coming out of California. And I'm sure that we are going to learn who and how this guy was radicalized, how he got his hands on a gun, what, if anything, could have been done to prevent it. But that community in California is got to be devastated, as is the LGBT community and their allies at large. All right, well, I've said a lot about that horrific situation as I wanted to. Let's get to something a little bit lighter, yet still important news, which is that Russia decided to go for a lunar mission because they didn't have really anything else going on, like a war that they're losing terribly. And so they sent a lunar lander up to the moon. It was supposed to land on the moon, first time in forever. but it crashed into the moon. Here's the headline to the New York Times. A Russian robotic spacecraft that was headed to the lunar surface has crashed into the moon. So Putin really trying to recover, but failing miserably. And the World Cup, the Women's World Cup concluded over the weekend, and it was Spain winning the championship, the Women's World Cup, for the first time, beating England in Sydney, Australia. And some major controversy I just read, there's always controversy, of course, but that King Charles or Prince William didn't go to the historic championship game with England in the World Cup final. Apparently, the culture secretary, Lucy Fraser, was there, but there was a lot of criticism that no member from the royal family attended the Women's World Cup final. But if that's the worst of the controversy, I'm sure there's something I'm missing, then that's not too bad. Not that surprising that King William didn't want to fly all the way down to Australia to support the English women, huh? And now finally, some of the political headlines I'm paying attention to over the weekend. The big news is that Trump officially says he will not be going to the first Republican debate, which is set to happen this Wednesday in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He put out a statement, "The public knows who I am and what a successful presidency I had. Therefore, I will not be doing the debates." So he said he won't be doing any of the debates. The spokesman didn't immediately clarify whether he plans to boycott every primary debate or just those that have currently been scheduled. Apparently, he's going to do some kind of counter-programming option where he'll probably get more ratings than all of those people on stage. Right now, the candidates who've met qualifications include Ron DeSantis, Chris Christie, Mike Pence, Vivek Ramaswamy, Governor Nikki Haley, South Carolina, Tim Scott, I think the former governor of Arkansas, Asa Hutchinson is going to be there too. Former Texas Representative Will Hurd, so far the only one who said definitively said he will not sign the pledge supporting whoever the Republican nominee is if Trump is the nominee. Christie has said he'll sign whatever it is needed to get him on stage. This is the RNC is demanding that you sign this pledge. And two headlines that are related, I think, are pretty telling, pretty illustrative. One, shock poll from CBS. Trump surges in Republican primary, now crushing Ron DeSantis in GOP field by whopping 46 points. I've never seen anything like this. He is 62%. DeSantis gets 16%. Ramaswamy in third place, 7%. Pence, 5%. Scott, 3%. Haley, 2%. Christie, 1%. Burgum, the billionaire guy, I don't know anything about him, and Hutchinson both also got 1%. But the other headline I saw, MAGA fans are more likely to trust information coming from Trump rather than from their own friends and family. Also in that CBS poll. I mean, that's what we're dealing with. I actually don't know anybody at this point that I'm close with, that I talk to at this point on any kind of regular basis, that is a Trump supporter. Or I would love to talk with them about that. And if you or someone you know is, then please let me know, and I'll reach out and have a thoughtful conversation, try to understand why you would trust Trump more than your own friends and family. That's a tough one right there. Specific, good question in that CBS poll. Also, I think I'll host a hangout if anybody wants to watch the Republican primary debate. It's pretty weird and unimportant, but I'm sure I'll watch it to live tweet it or post on social media and just as a form of entertainment. So if anybody wants to watch it Wednesday, I'm sure I'm going to watch it. I'll put out a link to watch with me. Do this from time to time. If you're a paid subscriber, you'll get that link. And one other story that I was paying close attention over the weekend is, you probably saw, maybe you didn't, maybe you don't care, but maybe you're not on Twitter, or X as it's called, but Elon Musk announced that they were going to remove the ability to block accounts on Twitter, which runs into the problem because you can't have a social media network on the Apple Store or the Google Store that doesn't allow people to block. So I think it might not be happening, but right-wing conservative actor James Woods, who was once a champion for Twitter CEO Elon Musk, took him to task, and Musk has come under fire from both conservatives and liberals over this idea, this dumb idea to completely remove the ability to block other users on the platform. Jimmy Woods, the actor, particularly vocally opposed the idea of the weekend, saying, "If the block feature is removed, I'll have no choice but to retire from this site." And he's a big deal conservative right-winger on the site. So we'll see what happens with the whole block issue. People keep pronouncing Twitter dead, and it still seems pretty alive. And a lot of people that I follow are still actively tweeting, saying things, including myself. So I'm not sure where we're at with that social media network. I'm on all of the rest. Please follow me over to Threads and TikTok and YouTube and Instagram and post, Mastodon, on all of them at Pete Dominic. And that is all I've got for you for the news update on this Monday, the 21st of August. A reminder, I'll be in Iowa City on September 6th doing a show. Tickets in the show notes if you want to go. Email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com. I want to know how many of you are coming. And this weekend, I'll be in Washington, D.C. If you want to hang out on Friday night or Saturday morning, Sunday morning, I will be there, and I'm trying to schedule a place for folks to get together and hang out. So email me if you want to meet. Just put subject Washington, D.C. I'll let you know where we're going to be, and hopefully I'll get to meet you, and you'll get to meet each other, and we'll be able to hang out and not die in a fire or a flood. D.C. looks like it's going to have good weather this weekend, right? Going down there for Glenn Kirshner's subscriber bash. Should be fun on Saturday night. Going to schedule some interviews. But I hope to see you if you're in that area. All right, well, let's get to my guests. Shall we? Every day I book real smart people who we can learn a lot from. Today is no exception. He is the author, editor of 10 books that have been translated into 24 languages, 3 of them New York Times bestsellers, the producer of multiple Emmy-nominated documentaries, vice president for global studies and fellows at New America, professor of practice at Arizona State University, CNN national security analyst. He's held teaching positions at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He's a pretty big deal guy, and he's hosting a new podcast for Audible, an Audible original called In the Room, where each week listeners are invited to join Peter Bergen as he covers topics like the Ukraine war, the Pentagon's long and schizophrenic relationship with UFOs, a rare peek inside the FBI's unit that is trying to prevent mass shootings, and a tour of the CIA's secret museum. He interviews top experts, and it's a really, really good show. I listened to several episodes before I interviewed him. You can get it on Audible, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. We talked a lot about the Afghan war. We had a bit of a disagreement about David Petraeus, and he did a lot of tapping on the table, which you might hear, and hopefully it's not too distracting. But I really loved this conversation with Peter Bergen, who I've known for a long time. Not well, I've known of his work. I've interviewed him a couple times. Used to see him when I was at CNN in the hallways, but I don't have, a relationship with the guy other than we know each other are, and I have respect for him and his work. His new podcast, again, In the Room. You can get it, listen to it, and our conversation begins right now. For the first time on the Stand Up with Pete Dominic podcast, Peter Bergen. Bergen, the legend, on the podcast with his own podcast. Congratulations. Thank you for joining me.
Pete, thank you.
Yeah. It's great, man. I love you in the podcast format. You're uniquely equipped for it. I wonder how you're feeling about hosting it and doing it. You started back in May.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, we've been working on it for well over a year before we went on the air because we're trying to build up a bank of episodes. And as you know from listening to some of them, they're highly produced, multiple voices in some cases. And so it all takes time. And it's a very bright group of people that are on board. And is it enjoyable? Yes. I mean, it's better than working for a living.
I love it. Well, I think your value is your experience as a journalist, of course. But for the podcast, I think, like me, actually, is kind of your Rolodex, who you know. And you know pretty much everybody in the lane and space that you have been traveling for years. You've written so many books. You've been reporting for CNN and now doing this podcast. I mean, everybody kind of wants to talk to you. So, I think that's probably the best thing about the podcast is who you get to talk to you. And you can't get everybody, can you?
Well, I mean, most people have said yes, but in the case of the show we just did on 2 shows on Afghanistan, the withdrawal, Ambassador Khalilzad, who was the principal architect of the withdrawal agreement with the Taliban, he refused multiple requests for interviews because it's kind of something he doesn't want to explore in any detail with anybody who has any knowledge of what happened.
Right. That was actually exactly who I was thinking of. Also, the former president of Afghanistan isn't doing interviews, is my understanding.
Well, I think he's done maybe 1 or 2 interviews, but he's keeping quiet most of the time.
So you're also covering, these last 2 episodes, I want to get into it with you about obviously what you have covered as well as anybody, national security, foreign policy, specifically in Afghanistan, specifically obviously Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, but you're covering not only that. I mean, there's some really interesting episodes that you've done, including, I think, the most recent one that's just dropped about COVID. So my question to you is, are you doing things outside national security, or is COVID probably the most important national security issue of our time?
Well, I think the latter, because more Americans have died of COVID than died in every American war since the American Revolution, at least 1.2 million. And COVID isn't over. I mean, we may have another big wave coming our way. So, yeah, I mean, we're covering national security broadly defined. I mean, we did an episode on fentanyl, which is fentanyl, opioid overdoses is now the leading cause of death for Americans between the age of 18 and 49. So if that is not a national security issue, I don't know what is. So anything that affects our security broadly defined is what we're hoping to cover.
You think you'll take on gun violence?
Yeah, we actually have a mass shooting episode coming up. Unfortunately, they're so common. We got unusual access to the behavioral unit at FBI at Quantico that there's a lot more work. Unfortunately, there's a lot more mass shootings in the United States, but also there's a lot more work understanding kind of the pathway to violence that a mass shooter goes down. They go down a fairly predictable path. People at the FBI well understand that path. If you understand something, you can maybe even try and prevent it. Of course, it's a lot easier to sort of explain how somebody went down the pathway to violence and ended up doing a mass shooting after the event than before. But we now have, the United States law enforcement community has a much better understanding of what a mass shooter does, whether it's a school shooter or some other kind of mass shooter.
Let's talk about your style, the Bergen style. You're a journalist. You're a journalist. You're a foreign policy journalist. You are a guy who's been doing it for a long time. You've seen it all. I don't know what adjectives you would describe about your feelings and attitude towards the politics of America, but you do your best to remain as objective as you can throughout your reporting. You always have, and that doesn't make everybody happy, kind of ever. What is your view of your role as the host of this podcast or as a journalist when you really are talking about the most divisive, controversial, life-threatening issues in the world all the time?
Well, I have a view that it's hard to be objective. None of us are objective. What I think what people can do as journalists or writers is to be fair, which is actually slightly different than objective, because of course you can't even do a story if you don't have a point of view about it. You'd be paralyzed. But what you can do is try and be fair to everybody involved. In fact, on the Afghan show that we just did, just had breakfast with the National Security Advisor from Afghanistan, who, in the piece, in this episode, he flees on the helicopter with President Ghani. Yeah. But he said that we treated him fairly, and I thought that I didn't ask him what he thought. He just volunteered that, and I think fairness is kind of the most important thing, because at the end of the day, we all come to everything with our own points of view. That's for sure. And in that episode specifically, you get every single point of view you can on the end of the war, the Afghan points of view. I mean, there's several Afghan points of view before we get to all of the rest. And I think it was super helpful. I loved it. I really got a lot of information I hadn't got, including the role of Ambassador Khalilzad, or and what he is or isn't saying about it all now. Can I go way back with you? You've been covering Al-Qaeda and terrorism since before most of us ever heard of it. Before 9/11, you actually interviewed Osama bin Laden, the only Western journalist, I think, to do so at that point, sure. I produced his first television interview. Bin Laden had talked to a Time magazine reporter. He talked to a British reporter. He talked to an Arabic, a Palestinian reporter, but we did his first television interview. And it was a big deal for them because, they didn't understand really anything about journalism, TV news, and they were very paranoid. They thought we might be agents of the CIA. But we did the interview, and he declared war on the United States, and, it went out in May of 1997. It got virtually no attention because, as far as most people have understood, he hadn't really done anything then. In fact, he had tried to kill some American soldiers in Yemen in 92, but that wasn't known. He made these threats, and then, of course, a year later, he blew up these 2 American embassies in Africa, killing 224 people. So that from that point forward, it was clear that he was serious. But at the time, even like when we did the interview with him, afterwards, he made all these threats. And I thought, okay, here we are in a mud hut in the middle of the night in Afghanistan. How do you attack the United States, which is 6,000 miles away? And the answer came a year later with blowing up two U.S. embassies in Africa within 9 minutes of each other.
And how do you attack the United States is you plan an attack, you organize it, you get the people to carry it out. Not that hard to do on a soft target especially. And so I've covered this story, the war in Afghanistan, I think. I've talked to all the stakeholders from every point of view, authors, journalists, veterans, Afghans, terrorist experts, national security experts. And I still subscribe to the idea that this 9/11 was planned in like internet cafes. And we know who carried it out. We know a lot about it. The idea that the United States military needed to occupy Afghanistan or fight in Afghanistan to prevent a future attack was something that a lot of people, smart people, never bought and still don't. I don't, especially now. And I wonder if you ever think that was, what the military strategy was ever going to achieve the ability to prevent Al-Qaeda from planning a terrorist attack in a chat room anywhere. Simply, as long as they have an internet connection, they can do what they did on 9/11.
Well, I don't disagree that there were internet chat rooms involved. So some of the key hijackers, were living in Germany. That said, the training for the 19 hijackers all took place geographically in Afghanistan. The recruiting all took place in Afghanistan. You had to recruit 19 people who were all willing to die. And you could say that, look at ISIS's attacks in the United States. They were not carried out by people trained by ISIS in Iraq. They were people self-recruited online. The attack in Florida by Omar Mateen, that killed 48 people at the
wasn't that the Yemeni cleric al-Awlaqi's videotapes?
It was really inspired by ISIS. But certainly al-Awlaqi has inspired people in the United States or elsewhere in the West to carry out attacks. So I'm not denying that internet radicalization is super important. But I also firmly believe that if you get trained by Al-Qaeda in a particular location, then you travel to the United States, you're going to be more effective. I'll give you an example from the ISIS point of view. So remember the 130 people who were killed in Paris, including quite a number of Americans in 2015. All those people have been trained by ISIS in Syria and Iraq. They were more effective because they've been trained on the ground. So I don't think these are either or categories. Physical training, meeting other like-minded people, physically exchanging business cards, that's pretty useful. You can also get radicalized on the internet, and you can sort of self-identify with a jihadist group. So both forms of recruitment and radicalization are important. On the question of was the military strategy in Afghanistan the right one? When the United States first went in, it went in with a very limited number of CIA paramilitary officers and CIA and U.S. Army Special Forces. And I think the mistake that we made at the beginning, look, if we could do it all again, I would have go light, go long, meaning say we're staying for a long time, don't have a huge, massive presence, keep it to special forces, advise and assist missions, special operations forces. We still have 25,000 American troops in Korea, 70 years after the end of the Korean War. They're keeping the peace between North Korea and South Korea. So you can imagine we only had 2,500 troops in Afghanistan at the end of when Biden pulled the plug. So, you and I can disagree about the precise military aspect, but I think that a relatively small U.S. military presence was enough to keep the Taliban from taking over the country,
I'm not even sure we do, because the light and long is kind of something I do subscribe to. And the idea that there were giant military bases with U.S. forces on them, with huge budgets that the American taxpayers are paying for. Let me go back. What that represents is what bin Laden said originally, which you can retell us. He was mad, and his complaint was about American influence in the Middle East, having bases in Saudi Arabia. That was, I think, his main complaint, because that's his country, of course, where his dad, made so much money, of course. And the Middle East conflict, our role in support for Israel. His complaints were pretty clear. Yeah. And we can agree or disagree with any part of it, but as long as we went in with a giant footprint to, obviously Iraq was a massive disaster, but Afghanistan or anywhere else, as long as we had these military bases, that was going to be the thing that was going to be the impetus for him and others. And more importantly, the presence of the American military and everything that we did, especially all the mistakes, torture, and so on, wasn't that the thing that radicalized more terrorists and ISIS? Didn't we fall right into bin Laden's playbook? Where do you disagree with that?
And look, on Iraq, we're in violent agreement. I mean, it was a huge
We're in violent agreement. I love it. Bergen, Dominic.
I mean, it was a huge unforced error. It resuscitated Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda in Iraq owes its existence to the Iraq War, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq eventually morphed into ISIS. So, I mean, if that was completely unnecessary. It resuscitated Al-Qaeda, the global jihadist movement. Muslims around the world flooded to Iraq to fight American troops, and it did seem to confirm what bin Laden had always claimed, that we had a sort of plan to take over the Middle East. So no argument on Iraq. On Afghanistan, if we could rewind the tape, maybe there was a way to do this and without substantial troop increases. It was President Obama who increased the presence of U.S. troops at the advice of his generals. Perhaps there might have been a better way to have a relatively small footprint throughout. And also, by the way, it costs you nothing to say, look, we plan to stay for a long time. You can always change your mind, but that doesn't cost you anything. And what the Afghans, the reason that the whole thing collapsed is when we start saying we're leaving, it wasn't just that we're pulling U.S. troops out. There were 15,000 American contractors and contractors from other countries. They all left. Every Western embassy pulled out. Yeah. It was a massive collapse of confidence. And, the Afghans, in the show that we did for Audible about this, we quote General Petraeus, who said, look, I was particularly annoyed and angered by the fact that President Biden claimed the Afghans didn't fight. That is not true. 66,000 Afghan soldiers and policemen died fighting the Taliban. 4,000 American and allied troops died fighting. So a much larger number of Afghans died fighting in their war, which is, of course, appropriate. So blaming the Afghans for our own, obviously the Afghans share some responsibility in all this, etc. But Afghans certainly fought. But once they didn't have, helicopters, air support, medevac, and once they saw the Americans were leaving and all our allies, there was a collapse of confidence, which the Taliban took advantage of.
I think Petraeus was right about that comment, criticizing Biden. I heard that from a lot of people. However, I was particularly annoyed with you for having him on. So pushback, that's my biggest pushback. That's my most controversial moment of our interview. I have no respect for him. He's never been right about the big things. I think he's a hack and a fraud, and I don't like him for what he has done to this country, his crimes, and the fact that we keep going to him for his expertise when he always gets it wrong. And then, of course, the whole syndrome of the bias of the generals. They want to keep fighting these wars for their own interests. I certainly believe that about him. So now you can destroy me, Bergen.
Well, I'm going to completely disagree with you, but we don't. I mean, but just on one factual point, for instance, David Petraeus was put in by George W. Bush in 2007 to basically turn around the war that was been lost, and he certainly played an instrumental role in U.S. casualties were off the charts, 100 a day. When he came in, and by the time, within a couple of years of violence, and it wasn't just American casualties, the Civil War greatly tamped down because of a change in tactics, change in leadership, some change. I mean, also some things on the ground that worked to America's advantage that, the General Petraeus took advantage of. For instance, so Sunni jihadists who'd been fighting the U.S. military, many of them turned their guns on Al-Qaeda. They were put on the American payroll. And so when you have 100,000 people who used to be shooting at you, then shooting at Al-Qaeda. So the United States, led by General Petraeus on the ground, adeptly made that decision. So, I just took sort of on a factual point where Petraeus got, I think, something right and got the big ideas right in Iraq.
I'd push back, but I want to get to some other things. And people have heard that argument plenty of times. They can decide for themselves. Tom Ricks, I remember saying on Meet the Press, the military historian, author, a lot of people respect, said, the issue with national security here is about energy. And that's why we had so much influence and interest. He's like, if we had our own energy, produce our own energy, whatever, that was so many years ago. And I still kind of wonder if you think there's any truth to that in terms of America's interest in the Middle East. But more importantly, getting to, as you do in the podcast episode, I think it was really important journalism, and people have forgotten this, but you mentioned it, the surge. That was the thing I disagreed the most with President Obama. I think it was 2009, October. I think I remember it. I covered it. I played his speech. His vice president was one of the few voices who didn't want to listen to the generals, and apparently in the end didn't when he became president. Tell me a little bit about that moment and the conflict there, because you cover it really well on the podcast.
Well, the military came to Obama and Biden with a plan for 10,000 troops, 40,000 troops, and 80,000 troops. And going into Afghanistan, they knew 80,000 was not going to fly, and 10,000 was sort of a low ball. And in the end, Obama added another 30,000 troops. He'd already added additional troops even after George W. Bush had left office. And I think both Obama and Biden felt that the generals had sort of were, I don't know, in a sense, railroading them with this decision. And Biden was certainly, as you say, the most vocal. Boxed
in was the phrase then. Didn't Obama write about it in his book? Sorry to interrupt you.
I feel like, Obama, I'm confident, felt that. And Biden certainly was the most senior foreign policy expert, vice president, had run the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was the most vocal voice in the cabinet saying we should go in just what they call at the time counterterrorism plus, relatively small. And I think Biden was right. I didn't necessarily think that at the time, but I was wrong. I think he was right. Because he was advocating for a force of sort of 20,000 or so troops that would basically focus on counterterrorism and not this bigger kind of counterinsurgency conventional war. But he lost that argument. But when he became president, I think, he'd had some scar tissue with the fights with the Pentagon over this.
Yeah.
And he General Milley, who was his chairman of the Joint Chiefs, advised him not to draw down from 2,500 to 0 troops, and he ignored that advice. As commander-in-chief, that is his prerogative. I think he made a mistake then. The Taliban are in control of Afghanistan 2 years later. They're better equipped than they've ever been in their history. They have $8.5 billion of equipment that was left behind, which is more than the budget of a lot of defense budget of a lot of European countries. So they're very well armed. They face no real opposition internally. And in some ways, they're more militant than the last time around. I mean, they keep narrowing the ability of women to do anything and women and girls to be educated. And they are a magnet for jihadist groups. By the way, there's a member of Al-Qaeda Leadership Council, according to the United Nations, is their Minister of the Interior, which is like running the FBI and the CIA and DHS combined. So Al-Qaeda, for the first time in history, has a cabinet position.
I mean, it's, I was going to say unbelievable, but I guess predictable what's happened there, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that
based on the changes, I mean, the whole history of the country, if people just know just a little bit, it's just so.
Well, I think we the United States made it, in the intelligence community, there's a mistake called mirror imaging, which is the assumption that everybody thinks just like you. And we thought with the Taliban, when they got into power, they would just become regular members of the international community because they want aid and because they want to be part of the community of nations. No. This would be like the Khmer Rouge walking into Cambodia after winning the war and suddenly becoming, capitalists or members of the international community. No, the Taliban have an ideological project. By and large, they're a very ideological bunch of people. They haven't spent 20 years fighting to become part, members of the, in good standing at the United Nations. And so we made a mistake. I say we, I certainly didn't ever think this because I've been in Afghanistan the last time the Taliban ruled. And I also know enough about history that people, when they say they have an ideology that they believe in, they probably do have this ideology and they probably do believe in it. I mean, Hitler was a Nazi, and I'm not saying the Taliban are anything close, but they are, theocratic jihadists intent on, creating a misogynist theocratic state. And, if people believe that they would modify their views, they were wrong. And we've had a controlled experiment for the last 2 years showing how wrong that view was.
I am reading your article about, I think you wrote for CNN, about the decision. We're revisiting it. Of course, it was how long now since we withdrew?
Well, I mean, the Taliban took Kabul on August the 15th, 2021. So we're pretty much exactly 2 years later.
And it's so important to remember it and talk about it. But as I'm, thinking about your work and listening to the podcast about Afghanistan, I just keep thinking about how much power an American president has to increase or decrease troop levels. It's all up to him, or maybe someday her. And, I remember reading about Obama, and I remember thinking, of course, he's agonizing over this decision. And by the way, after that troop surge, Derek Wyatt died, and I got to know his widow after she died. Like, a lot of Americans died after that troop surge. And of course, he's pouring over it, but it was left up to him. It was left up to Trump. It was left up to Biden, the troop levels. I don't know how, I don't have any suggestions as to how to do it better, but that seems like too much power for one person to perpetuate or increase troop levels like that.
Well, you'd have to go back to the Constitution, I think, to.
Well, yeah, you're not absolutely right. You're right. Legally, that's their choice.
Yeah, the president in the American system has tremendous authority, particularly as commander in chief. He or she can, as you say, make the decision to go to war. With sometimes with or without the. With obviously they need the consent of some kind of Congress.
Well, we haven't in my lifetime had the consent of Congress for war, not Vietnam or anything post, right?
Well, there was the Tonkin Resolution, which was a sort of okay to Lyndon Johnson in '64.
Yeah, to send okay. Go ahead. Sorry.
The Afghan War the Afghan War was different from these other wars in the sense
but they never called it a war. That was the thing about Vietnam, right? It was always it was a conflict. It wasn't a war. It's like Russia talking about Ukraine. It would seem. But
NATO invoked its collective right, Article 5 right after 9/11. The UN said the United States can kind of respond by any means necessary, and Congress overwhelmingly voted in favor of the war. There was only one dissenting vote. I think it was Barbara Lee. But in the Iraq War, of course, Joe Biden voted for it. So did
John Kerry.
Yeah. And so, Obama owes his presidency in many ways to the fact that Hillary Clinton voted for it. She found it very hard to.
I fully agree.
As a state senator, not a U.S. senator, sort of opposed the war.
That being said, in Afghanistan, getting back to that, the kind of politics around war has really interestingly changed. The lack of support for Ukraine from the right and for Russia, one might argue, is a thing we didn't, I'm sure you would think you'd see in your lifetime, Republicans saying. And then back to Afghanistan, most Americans, you can correct me, public opinion polls, but on both sides, didn't want to perpetuate that war, didn't want to spend any more money there. And I almost went my own personal opinion, a full horseshoe, because we broke it. We repaired a lot. Women had way more opportunities, and they were only going to maintain them if we stayed there. So I was almost like, maybe we should stay. Seeing as that it's our responsibility, women have more opportunity, maybe we should stay. Point is, attitudes have changed around military conflict and support for it. And in political ways that I don't think we would have predicted. And it certainly was the case with Afghanistan, right?
Well, I think polling suggested that most Americans wanted out. However, they certainly didn't want to get out in the way it happened, and they certainly didn't want the outcome. I mean, so if you ask them, there was no, even like on the left of the Democratic Party, it wasn't like there was a huge sort of banging the drum, we need to get out. I mean, Joe Biden made this decision with his, against military advice, and here we are. But yes, I think there obviously the United States goes in for waves, isolation, non-isolationism, and it's really dependent on what the facts on the ground are. I think if Americans had known that the Taliban would take over, Al Qaeda would be based in Afghanistan, if you put that in the polling question, they would. I think they'd be saying, well, maybe we should stay. And I do. A point I completely agree with you, Pete, is I think if we overthrow a government, we have some responsibility to not let catastrophe kind of.
I'm just quoting Dick Cheney in '94 on 60 Minutes when asked why didn't they go all the way and get Saddam. He said, because we knew the country would, three different segments, tribes basically it would break apart, and then I guess it was Colin Powell said if you break it you buy it, right? But I mean, Cheney predicted what happened in Iraq, and it's exactly what happened, and it's exactly what seems to always happen, unfortunately.
Well, I think Obama said some version of, look, you go in, it's a disaster. You don't go in, it's a disaster. You go in a big way, it's a disaster. You go in, you do nothing. Doing nothing is also a form of decision. And so if Trump had won the last election in Ukraine, maybe he would have done very little. And you mentioned Ukraine. Yes, amongst Republicans and I think Americans in general, support for the Ukraine war is on the wane. And I think Zelensky is very aware of that. There could be a Republican president in 2024, and that the politics around this suggests that he should, if he doesn't get this counteroffensive to some level of success, that the politics around this on the American side can change.
Yeah. You're still tapping, Peter, on that table.
Sorry.
Well, I only got, I think, one more big question here, which is, we haven't really talked about Trump. You certainly talked about his role in Afghanistan, his thoughts on it. It's really interesting in your podcast to hear, just any time, if it wasn't so scary and horrifying, that he's having a conversation with his military leaders when he was president. The lack of respect that he had for them openly to their faces, I mean, John, so many accounts of that, obviously. But my question to you is about your thoughts, seeing what you've seen on Trump's influence on certainly his supporters in the electorate on foreign policy, on these issues. Because my view is simply they'll kind of do whatever he says, which is probably not going to happen with a future president, Republican or Democrat. It's a thing that this kind of cult following. He was able to convince people whatever, but I'm sure you have a more thoughtful view of Trump's influence when it comes to foreign policy, much less anything you want to say about the choices he made and what the people you interviewed said about him.
Well, one of our shows, we interviewed John Bolton, and the show is already out. And Bolton has very strong views about his former boss.
Yeah.
And I put that same question to him, and Bolton replied, look, he thinks that this sort of isolationism of the Republican Party is a passing thing. I personally, I'm not so sure. If you the polling data you referred to, it's not. Look at Governor DeSantis, what he's been saying about Ukraine. Look by the RFK Jr. and what he's saying about Ukraine. So there's a guy. It's not just the Republican Party.
Why should our government spend any money in any other country doing anything?
I think that's a very common view in the United States. And I mean, it's a fairly understandable one when you look at the state of some of our infrastructure.
Right. Yeah.
However, I think the counter argument made by Republican internationalists like Bolton or others is that, we have no Americans on the ground in Ukraine. They're doing pretty well. Russia has basically handed itself, it's no longer a great power in the way that we used to think of it. It's a pretty weak power with nuclear weapons, which makes it dangerous. But if you can't defeat somebody on your own border, when you have, a much bigger population, at least on paper, a much better equipped army, I think that I'm very interested in the Soviet war against the Afghans, because if the Soviets couldn't defeat a lightly armed guerrilla force on their own border, because Afghanistan and the Soviet Union were, they shared a border at the time. That said a lot to people in Eastern Europe. I don't think it's a coincidence that Eastern Europe fell, that the local populations rose up because they saw that the Soviet Union was a paper tiger. Putin went to war to try and disrupt NATO. He's made NATO greater again. We already have 2 more members of NATO. Suddenly, all those countries that Trump was saying you need to pay 2% of your GDP, they're all upping the ante because they've seen what's happening. So, if you believe, whether you're Republican or Democrat or independent, that NATO is important, certainly the Ukraine war has shown its importance. And I read a very interesting thing.
Well, you probably don't believe it because you've heard Trump savage NATO for so long. There's not.
I read a piece. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but the Congress could pass a law which would prevent any future president just pulling out of NATO arbitrarily. When we interviewed John Bolton, he said Trump would pull out of NATO tomorrow if he becomes president again. And that NATO, Jim Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense for Trump, described NATO as the most successful alliance in modern history. This is a guy who knows a lot about history and alliances and the military. And I agree with him. I mean, it's been the only time Article 5, the collective right to self-defense, came into play was when we got attacked on 9/11. So we, the United States, when Trump attacks NATO, he never mentions the hundreds of, not just the money of all these, but also the fact that so many NATO countries sent troops to Afghanistan. The French, the Germans, the Brits, hundreds of them died. And it wasn't even their war, and they still stepped up to the plate. So I hope that, like pulling out of NATO is just it would be not a smart idea.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you. And what we've seen in terms of NATO's strength and influence growing as a result of Putin's invasion, everything backfired on that guy. Everything he wanted. He had so much more power in February of 22 than he does now. I mean, half the people there want to kill him. I mean, half the people, what do I know? But I mean, obviously we've all seen what's played out there, and he's weaker by every measure, it would seem.
Yeah, I agree.
Finally, I do have to ask you, you did an episode of your great podcast that we're talking about, which is a great team. I know what it takes to produce something like that. And you really work hard on these episodes, which is why I'm learning so many different points of views. You did a Michael Flynn deep dive. Terrifying that guy was so close to Donald Trump, obviously, the president of the United States, but also just crazy what happened to him. Tell me anything you want. People should go listen to that interview.
Well, Mike Flynn he was National Security Advisor for Trump for 21 days. He was a very well-regarded special operations officer in Afghanistan and Iraq. He got sort of let go early from running Defense Intelligence Agency during the Obama administration. He seemed to have gone down a lot of rabbit holes. He keeps going down a lot of rabbit holes. He was arguing for martial law to rerun the 2020 election. He was at a bonkers meeting of the White House on December 18th, 2021, making that case. December 18th, 2020. He's now a sort of a hero of the Christian nationalist right. He's on this Reawaken America tour, which we went down to Miami. He kind of accosted me there.
Oh, really? Yeah, right.
Because for reasons best known to himself, and he is,
were you selling adrenochrome? Is that why?
I don't even know what adrenochrome is.
Well, he does. I mean, that's how far he's gone. The children's blood. I mean, the whole QAnon conspiracy theory. He's all about that. I mean, I don't know how a guy devolves that much into that if he wasn't already vulnerable to that. I mean, my understanding is that Obama said to Trump on the day he handed over power, he whispered, "Hey man, listen, one thing I got to tell you, that Michael Flynn, he's crazy. Got to get rid of him." And of course, Trump heard that as, well, promote that guy. Okay. Obama hates him, promote him. I think that's actual reporting.
That Obama told him, the biggest problem you're going to face is North Korea, and don't hire Mike Flynn. Anyway, so
and don't eat the fruit cake. But those are the three things. That's a pretty high priority thing to say.
But if Trump wins the Republican nomination, which seems very likely right now, Mike Flynn, and then wins the presidency, which is certainly not out of the question, Flynn is going to be back. Because Flynn has really kept the faith. Trump pardoned him for lying to the FBI, and Flynn is going around the country really, on these tours of. He's a huge hero. He's referred to as America's general. Trump, with the rally we were at in Miami, Trump called in and said, we want you to stay healthy. We want you back, Mike. And, so he represents this pretty extreme part of the, Christian nationalist right. And he is a leader, or the leader of that movement right now.
I love your podcast. I've always loved your work. I wonder if you making your name in covering terrorism, national security, foreign policy, how much you think about the greatest threat now to America, where you are a citizen, is my understanding. We've allowed you to be a citizen.
I was born in Minneapolis, which helps. So.
Oh, I didn't know that. I did not know that. And I wonder how much you take all of your skill set, as some others, kind of in your world have, and focus on the domestic threat of terrorism here in the U.S. that we've seen far more domestic terrorist attacks and foreign terrorist attacks. And I wonder how much you think about that and how much you'll be covering that.
Well, I mean, I remember the Oklahoma City bombing like it was yesterday.
Yeah, me too.
And we did a lot of work on that. And, the only good thing about the Oklahoma City bombing is it really killed the militia movement for quite a while. In this country, there was a lot of law enforcement pressure. And so if you think about January 6th, the indictments that Trump has, presented himself for, the protests have been pretty minor. And I think, look, there's a huge demonstration effect when 1,000 people are arrested many of them are charged with relatively serious crimes, some of them with pretty long prison sentences. I think that's had a big demonstration effect. I hope that demonstration effect continues, because I think we're going to be in for a rocky ride with all the different indictments, all the different cases. Trump's ability to, what we saw on January 6th speaks for itself. So, but yes, I mean, right-wing extremist terrorism has been a feature of this country for a long time. It's certainly the number one concern of the FBI right now. I do think this law enforcement effort against the January 6th people who engaged in that riot has been useful. Hopefully will continue to be so. We'll also, so if anything good came from it, it is that.
Right. Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. And I think it's absolutely true, of course. And I look forward to hearing you talking more about that and everything else that you're doing on the podcast. And I'll give it all the plugs again on the way out. Of course, Peter, it's such a pleasure to catch up with you and talk to you. It's been a really long time, and I never stopped following you and reading you, and I won't now. So I appreciate you so much joining me.
Oh, Pete, well, thank you so much. Thank you very much.
All right, there he goes, Peter Bergen, everybody, in the room, the Audible original podcast. Go listen and subscribe to that podcast. Get his books. Follow him on social media. Hopefully you enjoyed that and got a lot out of that conversation. PeterBergen.com. Let him know if you did. He's on all the social medias as well. And that was awesome. I really enjoyed that, and I'm glad that you're still listening here at the end, because I just want to say thank you very much for getting started the week with me, and looking forward to having a whole bunch of awesome guests on this week. Let me know, as always, who you want to hear. standupwithpete@gmail.com. Anytime you want, send me that email. I love to get your emails, and that is all I have for you today, but I will be here maybe later again today, maybe tonight, but definitely tomorrow, as this is a daily podcast. Tell your friends, write a review on Spotify or iTunes, subscribe on YouTube and TikTok and Instagram and Threads and all of the rest. If you haven't signed up for a paid subscription, hey, now is the time. You can always do it. Patreon.com/Pete Dominic. That's it. That's all. John Carroll taking us out. Talk to you tomorrow, folks. Stay in the moment, because maybe the best is yet to come.
You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. And even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up, and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well, and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.